The moment a billionaire stopped smiling, an entire room realized they had underestimated the wrong person. The private dining room on the top floor of the Sterling house had been filled with the soft clink of crystal glasses, polite laughter, and conversations worth more than most homes in Manhattan. Men and women in tailored suits discussed mergers, market forecasts, and billion-dollar acquisitions as if they were deciding what to order for dessert. Every chair around the polished walnut table belonged to someone whose name regularly appeared in business magazines, except one. She wasn't sitting with them. She was quietly pouring sparkling water. Claire Bennett moved through the room with practiced grace, her black apron pressed neatly over a crisp white shirt, her blonde hair tied into a simple ponytail, her expression calm enough to disappear into the background. The guests barely noticed her. They noticed the wine selection. They noticed each other's watches. They noticed Ethan Carter. Everyone noticed Ethan Carter. At 38, he had built Carter Capital into one of the most influential investment firms in America. Financial television called him a visionary. Competitors called him ruthless. His friends simply called him impossible to impress. Ethan leaned back in his chair, adjusting the cuff of his navy suit as another executive finished describing an artificial intelligence startup. Too expensive, Ethan said without looking up from the quarterly report on his tablet. You're buying headlines, not value. The table nodded immediately. Nobody challenged him. Nobody ever did. Claire silently refilled another glass before turning toward Ethan's seat. More sparkling water, sir? She asked politely. Ethan finally looked up. His eyes lingered on her for only a second before drifting back to his screen. Sure. She poured carefully, thanked him with a small nod, and started to leave. Then one of Ethan's closest associates laughed. Ethan, you've spent the entire evening criticizing everyone's investments. Ask someone outside finance for advice. Maybe you'll finally hear something original. A few guests chuckled. Ethan smirked. Outside finance. His eyes followed Claire as she reached the next table. Perfect. Several people exchanged amused glances. Claire stopped walking when she heard her name. Miss? Ethan called casually. She turned with the same composed smile she had offered every customer that evening. Yes, sir. Ethan rested both elbows on the table. I've got a question for you. More faces turned toward them. Conversations nearby faded. Claire waited patiently. If I handed you $1 million today, Ethan said with playful confidence, where would you invest it? A wave of quiet laughter circled the room. One executive whispered, this should be entertaining. Another reached for his wine, already expecting the awkward silence that usually followed questions like that. Claire didn't answer immediately. She looked at Ethan for a brief moment, then glanced at the untouched fillet on his plate before returning her attention to him. Her face remained calm. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't intimidated. She simply seemed to be thinking. Ethan smiled wider. Take your time, he added. Financial advice isn't usually on the menu. More laughter. Claire folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough that everyone leaned in without realizing it. May I ask one question before I answer yours? Ethan raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. Claire held his gaze without arrogance and without fear. Are you looking for real financial advice? Or are you looking for someone to confirm what you've already decided? The laughter vanished so completely that the only sound left was the quiet hum of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Ethan's smile disappeared. For the first time that evening, he lowered his tablet. Around the table, no one moved. No one reached for another drink. No one interrupted the silence. Because somehow, with a single sentence spoken in the gentlest voice in the room, the waitress everyone had overlooked had just asked the only question no billionaire in that room had ever expected to answer. For several long seconds, Ethan Carter said nothing. The confidence that had filled his face only moments earlier gave way to something unfamiliar. Curiosity. Around the polished table, executives shifted quietly in their chairs, each waiting for him to respond first. Ethan slowly placed his tablet beside his plate and studied Claire with far more attention than he had given her when she had simply been the woman pouring water. Real financial advice, he finally answered. Assume I actually mean it. Claire gave a small nod. Then my answer would depend on one thing. Ethan folded his hands. Which is, whether that $1 million is meant to make you richer or make your future safer. A few people exchanged puzzled looks. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Explain. Claire spoke without rushing, her voice steady enough that it never sounded like a lecture. Most people believe investing begins with choosing an asset. I think it begins with understanding the purpose of the money. A portfolio without a purpose usually follows emotions instead of discipline. The room remained silent. Claire continued, "If your goal is long-term wealth, I would not start by asking what is exciting today. I would ask what will still matter 20 years from now. Markets change. Headlines change. Human behavior changes much more slowly." Ethan noticed something unusual. She never tried to impress anyone. She did not use complicated words to sound intelligent. Every sentence felt simple, but every sentence seemed to carry another layer beneath it. "Go on," he said quietly. Claire glanced toward the untouched breadbasket before looking back at him. "Diversification is important, but conviction matters too. Owning 50 investments you do not understand is not safer than owning 5 that you truly understand." One executive cleared his throat. "That sounds like something Warren Buffett would say." Claire smiled politely. Many wise investors have expressed similar ideas in different ways. Good principles survive because they continue to work. Ethan noticed that she had answered the comment without becoming defensive. She accepted the observation, then calmly moved the conversation forward. It was the kind of composure he expected from senior partners negotiating billion-dollar transactions, not from someone wearing a black apron inside a restaurant. "Suppose inflation stays stubbornly high?" Ethan asked. "What would you adjust first?" Claire answered almost immediately. "Nothing." Several eyebrows rose around the table. Ethan leaned forward. "Nothing. Not unless my original assumptions changed." Temporary economic conditions often tempt investors to abandon long-term strategies. That is usually more expensive than inflation itself. One guest quietly set down his fork. Another stopped taking notes on his phone. Nobody seemed interested in dessert anymore. Claire was no longer serving dinner. Somehow, she had become the center of the evening. Ethan rested his chin lightly against one hand. "You sound like someone who has managed institutional money." Claire simply smiled. "No, sir." "Then where did you learn to think like this?" She hesitated for the first time. It lasted only a heartbeat. "Books, conversations, observation, mistakes. The market teaches anyone willing to listen." Ethan noticed that she had answered the question without truly answering it. She had revealed nothing about herself. Yet somehow, she had revealed enough to make him want to know more. Across the table, one of Ethan's partners laughed softly. "You have to admit this is the best investment discussion we have had all month." A few people nodded in quiet agreement. Ethan did not laugh. His eyes remained fixed on Claire. "One last question," he said. "If someone offered you $1 million today, would you invest all of it?" Claire shook her head. "No." "Why not?" "Because before money can grow, it has to survive. I would first make certain that the people I love would never have to worry about tomorrow." Wealth is not measured by how much you can risk. It is measured by how much peace of mind you can create. Once again, silence settled over the private dining room. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of evening lights. Inside, nobody seemed interested in the skyline anymore. Ethan looked at the woman standing only a few feet away and realized something that unsettled him more than any market crash ever had. He had intended to entertain his guests with a harmless joke. Instead, he had just met someone who seemed completely untouched by his wealth, his reputation, or the invisible influence that usually controlled every room he entered. For the first time in years, Ethan Carter found himself wondering not whether someone knew finance, but how much of their story they had chosen not to tell. Claire noticed the silence lingering a moment longer before she offered a respectful nod. "If there is nothing else you need this evening, I should return to my other tables." Ethan looked at her as though he had only just realized she was still standing. "Of course," he replied quietly. "Thank you." It was a simple sentence, but several people around the table exchanged surprised glances. Ethan Carter rarely thanked anyone during business dinners. Claire smiled politely and walked away with the same calm, unhurried pace she had carried from the beginning of the evening. She did not glance back. She did not wait to see anyone's reaction. Within seconds, she was helping another couple celebrate an anniversary across the dining room, recommending a dessert to an elderly gentleman, and quietly replacing an empty coffee cup before its owner even noticed. Ethan found himself watching her instead of the financial reports still resting beside his plate. She moved through the restaurant with remarkable awareness, remembering names, noticing details, anticipating requests before customers spoke them aloud. There was no performance in her kindness. It appeared effortless, almost instinctive. "Well," one executive finally said with a laugh, "I certainly did not expect tonight to turn into an investment seminar." Another smiled. "Neither did I, but she made more sense in 10 minutes than half the analysts who present to us every quarter." Someone else added, "Do you think she really learned all that from books?" Ethan did not answer immediately. His attention remained fixed on Claire as she carefully helped an elderly woman adjust her chair before returning to the kitchen carrying an empty tray. "No," he said at last. "People do not develop that kind of thinking by accident." His chief financial officer leaned closer. "You think she has professional experience?" Ethan slowly nodded. "I think she has experience she deliberately chose not to mention." The observation settled over the table. It was unusual for Ethan to admit uncertainty about someone after only one conversation. Usually he could summarize a person's strengths and weaknesses within minutes. Tonight, however, every answer Claire had given seemed to create another question. Dinner gradually resumed, but the conversation had changed. Instead of discussing acquisitions and stock valuations, the guests found themselves debating patience, discipline, and long-term thinking. More than once, someone repeated one of Claire's observations. Ethan noticed something remarkable. The room was still discussing her ideas long after she had walked away. He quietly reached for the leather check folder that had just been placed beside his plate. Without looking at the total, he slipped his credit card inside, then paused before closing it again. "Excuse me," he said to a passing server. "Could you ask Claire to come back for a moment?" A minute later she returned, carrying the same composed expression. "Is everything satisfactory this evening, sir?" Ethan looked directly at her. "Everything has been excellent." He slid the folder toward her. "There is something inside for you." Claire opened it politely. The gratuity was $20,000. Her expression changed only slightly, but enough for Ethan to notice genuine surprise. She gently closed the folder and placed it back on the table. "I appreciate your generosity," she said softly, "but I cannot accept this." One of the executives blinked in disbelief. Ethan looked equally surprised. "You cannot." Claire shook her head. "That amount is not a tip anymore. It becomes something else. I was simply doing my job." Ethan folded his arms. "Think of it as a consulting fee." Claire smiled with quiet warmth. "Then I would still have to decline." "May I ask why?" Ethan said. Claire's eyes reflected neither pride nor embarrassment. "Because advice only has value when both people walk away respecting each other. If I accepted money simply because you were surprised that a waitress understood finance, then I would be allowing your first impression to define my worth. I would rather keep serving dinner than sell my self-respect." The words landed gently, yet they carried enough weight to leave the table silent once again. Ethan looked at the woman standing before him and realized that the most valuable thing she had offered him that evening had never been financial advice. It was perspective, and unlike every investment he had ever purchased, this one could not be bought at any price. Claire gently pushed the leather folder back across the table before offering the same courteous smile she had given every guest that evening. "I hope you enjoy the rest of your dinner," she said softly. Without waiting for another response, she picked up the empty water bottle from a nearby service station and quietly disappeared through the swinging kitchen doors. The dining room gradually returned to its gentle rhythm. Glasses clinked. Soft piano music floated through the room once again. Conversations slowly resumed, but Ethan barely heard any of them. His attention remained fixed on the closed kitchen door. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions across 3 continents. He had convinced skeptical investors to trust impossible ideas. He had persuaded boards of directors to approve deals that reshaped entire industries. Yet somehow, a waitress had calmly declined more money than many Americans earned in several months without sounding offended, impressed, or tempted. It was not the refusal that unsettled him. It was the reason behind it. One of his longtime partners finally broke the silence. "You realize she just turned down $20,000. Ethan nodded absent-mindedly. "I know. Nobody does that." Ethan looked down at the untouched folder. "Someone who values something more than money does." His chief financial officer leaned back thoughtfully. "You still think she has a finance background?" Ethan slowly smiled, though it was no longer the confident smile everyone in the room recognized. It was quieter, almost thoughtful. I think we have been asking the wrong question all evening. What is the right one? Another executive asked. Ethan answered without hesitation. Why is someone with that mind serving dinner? No one offered an explanation. Each possibility sounded less believable than the last. Perhaps she had inherited money and simply enjoyed working. Perhaps she had once worked in finance, but retired early. Perhaps she was preparing for graduate school. None of those theories seemed to fit the woman they had just met. She carried herself with too much humility to be performing a role, and too much discipline to be improvising one. Ethan picked up his phone beneath the table and opened a secure messaging application that only a handful of people inside Carter Capital could access. He typed a brief message. Find everything you legally can about Claire Bennett. Works at the Sterling House. Education. Employment history. Professional licenses. Public records. Priority. He looked at the screen for several seconds before pressing send. The message disappeared instantly. Across the dining room, Claire emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray filled with fresh coffee. She stopped beside an elderly couple celebrating what appeared to be an anniversary. Ethan watched as she noticed the woman's trembling hands before she attempted to lift the heavy porcelain cup. Without saying a word, Claire quietly poured the coffee into a lighter mug that was easier to hold. The older woman smiled with visible relief. Claire simply wished them a wonderful evening and continued walking. She never drew attention to the gesture. She never expected recognition. Ethan noticed another detail moments later. A young server accidentally dropped a fork onto the floor near the service station. Before anyone else reacted, Claire had already handed the nervous young employee a clean replacement and quietly continued carrying her tray, allowing the younger server to avoid embarrassment in front of customers. She solved small problems with the same calm precision she had used while discussing investment strategy. Whether she was analyzing financial markets or replacing silverware, her instinct was always the same. Notice first. Act quietly. Never make someone else feel small. Ethan found himself wondering whether that mindset had always belonged to her or whether life had taught it to her over time. His phone vibrated softly. A preliminary reply had already arrived from his security director. Employment records confirmed. Claire Bennett. Age, 27. No criminal record. No professional finance licenses. Local apartment lease. Restaurant employment verified. College education appears incomplete. Additional research in progress. Ethan frowned slightly. Incomplete college education did not explain institutional-level thinking. If anything, it made the mystery even deeper. He slipped the phone back into his pocket just as Claire walked past their table one more time. She acknowledged the guests with a warm smile before disappearing toward another section of the restaurant. Ethan watched her leave, feeling something he had not experienced in years. It was not admiration alone. It was the unmistakable realization that the most valuable person he had met in months was someone the world had almost completely overlooked. The dinner finally came to an end just after 9:30 that evening. Guests gathered their coats, exchanged handshakes, and disappeared into waiting town cars beneath the warm glow of Manhattan streetlights. Ethan walked through the restaurant lobby more slowly than usual. Before stepping outside, he glanced back one final time. Claire was helping the hostess reorganize tomorrow's reservation book, while another server laughed about something that had happened in the kitchen. She smiled quietly, then picked up a stack of menus and carried them toward the dining room as though the evening had been completely ordinary. There was no sign that she had spent the last hour astonishing some of the most successful investors in New York. Ethan slipped into the back seat of his black sedan, but instead of asking his driver to head home, he stared silently through the window as the city lights reflected across the glass. His assistant, Daniel Brooks, looked up from the front passenger seat. Office. Ethan nodded. Office. The drive downtown lasted barely 15 minutes, yet Ethan spent every minute replaying the conversation in his mind. It was not only what Claire had said. It was what she had chosen not to say. Most people in business tried to prove how intelligent they were. Claire had done the opposite. She had answered only what was asked, revealed almost nothing about herself, and somehow left everyone wanting to hear more. That kind of restraint fascinated him. By the time they reached Carter Capital headquarters, most of the building was dark. Only a handful of lights still glowed across the executive floor. Ethan walked directly into his office overlooking the Hudson River. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the quiet skyline, while Daniel placed a slim folder on the conference table. "This is everything we could verify tonight," he said. Ethan opened the folder immediately. Claire Bennett, 27 years old. Current address: restaurant employment. Volunteer work at a neighborhood literacy program every Saturday morning. No social media activity beyond a dormant account with almost no photographs. No visible investments. No business ownership. No luxury purchases. Everything about her life appeared surprisingly ordinary. Ethan frowned. There has to be more. Daniel adjusted his glasses. "We searched professional licensing databases, finance associations, and public employment records. Nothing." Ethan tapped the folder thoughtfully. Someone who understands behavioral finance at that level does not simply wake up one day knowing it. Daniel nodded. "I thought the same thing." Ethan continued reading. Community college enrollment appeared several years earlier before transferring to Columbia University. The record stopped abruptly after only a short period. No graduation date. No explanation. Ethan looked up. "Did she drop out?" "We do not know yet," Daniel admitted. "The university records available tonight are incomplete." Ethan leaned back slowly. The missing information bothered him more than the information itself. Successful people usually enjoyed telling the world about their achievements. Claire seemed to have erased hers. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "There is one more thing." Ethan looked up. "What is it?" The manager at the restaurant described her as the employee everyone depends on. She never asks for special treatment. She covers extra shifts without complaining. She trains new servers. She volunteers whenever someone has a family emergency. Apparently, she has refused promotions more than once. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Refused promotions? According to him, yes. Ethan walked toward the windows overlooking the river. The city below pulsed with energy, ambition, and endless competition. Every day, thousands of people fought desperately for a better title, a larger office, or a higher salary. Yet somehow the woman who had quietly dismantled his assumptions with a few thoughtful sentences had repeatedly declined opportunities to climb higher. That decision made even less sense than the missing university records. His phone vibrated softly. A new message from the research department appeared on the screen. Additional archive search in progress. Preliminary indication that Claire Bennett may have participated in a national collegiate investment competition several years ago. Records incomplete. Verification pending. Ethan read the message twice before locking his phone. A slow smile crossed his face. At last, the first loose thread had appeared. Whatever story Claire Bennett had chosen to leave behind, he was beginning to realize it had never truly disappeared. It had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to notice where it began. The following morning began long before sunrise for Claire Bennett. While much of Manhattan was still wrapped in silence, she unlocked the side entrance of the Sterling house carrying a small paper cup of coffee and a worn canvas tote bag. The kitchen lights had only just been switched on, and the familiar aroma of fresh bread and roasted coffee beans slowly filled the quiet restaurant. Claire tied on her apron, greeted the pastry chef with a warm smile, and immediately began arranging polished silverware for the breakfast service. Nothing about her routine suggested that the previous evening had changed anything. To everyone around her, she was simply Claire, the dependable waitress who always arrived early and somehow noticed every detail before anyone else did. "Good morning," said Emily, one of the newer servers. "You covered my closing duties last night after I left early. Thank you again." Claire smiled while folding another linen napkin. "Your father was in the hospital. You had somewhere more important to be." Emily shook her head with quiet admiration. "You always make everyone else's problems seem lighter." Claire only shrugged. "That is because everyone carries something heavy. We just do not always see it." Before Emily could answer, the restaurant manager, Richard Collins, walked briskly across the dining room holding a clipboard. "Claire, do you have a minute?" She nodded and followed him toward his office. Richard closed the door behind them before letting out a quiet sigh. "I heard about last night." Claire smiled faintly. "I assumed you would." Richard rested both hands on his desk. "Several guests called this morning before we even opened. They wanted to compliment you." Claire looked slightly embarrassed. That was kind of them. One of them was Ethan Carter. Claire remained silent. Richard continued. "He personally thanked the restaurant for employing someone with your professionalism." Claire lowered her eyes briefly. "I am glad he enjoyed his evening." Richard studied her expression. "That is all you have to say?" She looked up with quiet sincerity. He came here for dinner. My responsibility was to make sure he had a good experience. Richard laughed softly. You realize most people would have spent the entire night talking about meeting one of the richest investors in America. Claire returned to arranging reservation cards that had been left on his desk. Money does not change the way I greet people. Richard smiled knowingly. That is probably why everyone trusts you. As Claire returned to the dining room, her phone vibrated inside her apron pocket. It was a reminder she had set weeks earlier. Saturday, 9 o'clock, Community Learning Center. She glanced at the time and smiled. Breakfast service would finish just in time. 2 hours later, after helping serve dozens of guests, Claire changed into a simple blue sweater and jeans before walking 6 blocks to a modest neighborhood library where volunteers gathered every weekend. Inside one of the classrooms, a dozen teenagers sat around folding tables with notebooks open. Miss Bennett is here, one student called excitedly. Claire smiled as several young faces looked up. Good morning, everyone. Did anyone complete the budgeting exercise from last week? Nearly every hand rose into the air. Claire's smile widened. Excellent. Today we are going to learn something even more important. One student asked curiously, is it about investing? Claire gently shook her head. No. Before you learn how to grow money, you should learn how not to let money control your decisions. She wrote a simple sentence across the whiteboard in large letters. Wealth follows discipline before it follows opportunity. The students copied every word carefully. Claire spent the next hour explaining emergency savings, responsible borrowing, and long-term planning using simple examples everyone could understand. There were no complicated charts, no impressive speeches, and no expensive presentation slides. Only patience, kindness, and practical wisdom. Across town, Ethan sat in his office reading another report that had just arrived from his research team. Most of the pages contained ordinary records until one paragraph caught his attention. Volunteer instructor. Community financial literacy program. Weekly service. No compensation received. Ethan stared at the line for several moments before quietly closing the folder. The mystery surrounding Claire Bennett had not become smaller overnight. Somehow, with every new fact he discovered, it had only grown deeper. The woman who had quietly challenged one of Wall Street's sharpest minds seemed to spend her free time teaching strangers how to avoid financial mistakes without asking for anything in return, and Ethan could not shake the growing feeling that the greatest investment lesson he had ever encountered had very little to do with money at all. Late that Saturday afternoon, Ethan stood alone in his office holding the newest report his research team had finally completed. Unlike the previous files, this one contained a section that had not appeared in any public database. It had taken several phone calls and archived university records to uncover it. Across the top of the page, one line immediately caught his attention. Columbia University Graduate School of Business. National Collegiate Investment Challenge. Finalist team captain. Ethan slowly lowered himself into the chair behind his desk. Beneath the headline were several scanned newspaper clippings from nearly 6 years earlier. One photograph showed a younger Claire Bennett standing beside 4 teammates, holding a trophy while smiling with the quiet confidence he now recognized. Another article described how her team had produced one of the most accurate long-term portfolio strategies in the competition's history. Judges had praised her ability to combine technical analysis with behavioral psychology, predicting that she would become one of the brightest young investment managers of her generation. Ethan stared at the articles in disbelief. There it is, he whispered to himself. I knew it. Daniel entered the office carrying another folder. We finally found the missing years. Ethan motioned toward the chair opposite him. Tell me everything. Daniel opened the file carefully. She attended Columbia on an academic scholarship after transferring from community college. Faculty evaluations consistently ranked her at the top of her class. She received internship offers from several major investment firms before graduation. Ethan frowned. Then why is she serving tables? Daniel turned another page. Because she never graduated. Ethan looked up immediately. Why? Daniel hesitated before answering. 3 months before her final semester, her father suffered a severe stroke. Ethan remained silent. Daniel continued quietly. Medical expenses became overwhelming. Insurance covered only part of the treatment. Claire withdrew from school, declined every internship offer, and accepted multiple service jobs to help support her family. Ethan slowly leaned back, saying nothing. Daniel continued reading. Her father passed away less than a year later. By then, the internship opportunities had expired. Recruiters had already filled their positions, and Claire never reapplied. The office became completely silent. Outside the windows, ferries crossed the Hudson River beneath the fading afternoon sunlight, but Ethan barely noticed them. He looked again at the photograph of Claire holding the university trophy. The smile on her face was almost identical to the one she wore while greeting customers at the restaurant. The difference was not in her expression. It was in the direction her life had taken afterward. "There is more," Daniel said gently. Ethan nodded. "Go ahead." Several professors described her as unusually gifted. One even wrote that she possessed an uncommon ability to explain complex financial concepts in language anyone could understand. Ethan smiled faintly. "I have already witnessed that myself." Daniel closed the folder. One professor added something interesting. Ethan looked up. "What?" Daniel read the final sentence aloud. "Claire Bennett never wanted to become the richest person in finance. She wanted to become the person ordinary families trusted most with financial knowledge." Ethan remained quiet for several moments. He remembered the classroom filled with teenagers. He remembered the volunteer reports. He remembered the $20,000 gratuity she had calmly refused. Suddenly, every piece of the puzzle fit together. Claire had not walked away from her values after leaving Columbia. She had carried them with her into every chapter of her life. The profession had changed. The purpose had not. Ethan stood and walked toward the windows once again. "All this time," he said softly, "I believed success was measured by how many talented people I could recruit." Daniel waited. Ethan continued. "Maybe I should have been asking how many remarkable people the world quietly loses because life interrupts their plans." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "What will you do now?" Ethan looked down at the photograph one last time before placing it carefully back into the folder. His answer came without hesitation. "I am not going to offer her a job because she needs one." He smiled quietly. "I am going to ask whether there is a dream she never had the chance to finish." For the first time since that unforgettable dinner, Ethan no longer felt driven by curiosity alone. What had begun as an attempt to solve a mystery had become something far more personal. He wanted to meet Claire Bennett again, not as a billionaire testing a waitress, but as one human being hoping to understand another. 3 evenings later, Ethan returned to the Sterling house without an entourage, without business partners, and without reserving the private dining room. He requested a quiet table near one of the tall windows overlooking the avenue where the first autumn leaves drifted gently across the sidewalk. When Claire approached with a menu in her hands, she recognized him immediately, but her expression remained as calm as it had been during their first meeting. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," she said warmly. "Welcome back." Ethan smiled. "This time I am only here for dinner." Claire nodded. "Then I hope we can make it an enjoyable one." She handed him the menu before turning to another table, treating him no differently than anyone else in the restaurant. Ethan noticed that detail immediately. His reputation had not changed her behavior the first time, and it did not change it now. Nearly an hour passed before the dinner service slowed enough for Claire to refill his coffee. Ethan looked up. "Do you have 5 minutes after your shift?" Claire paused for only a moment. "If this is about another investment question, I should warn you that my answers are still complimentary." Ethan laughed softly. "Actually, I was hoping to ask about something entirely different." She studied his expression and sensed a sincerity that had not been there during their first encounter. "I finish in 20 minutes, she replied. "I can spare a few." After the last guests departed, the restaurant became wonderfully quiet. Chairs were placed upside down on distant tables while staff polished glasses and prepared for the following day. Claire carried 2 cups of coffee onto the small outdoor terrace behind the restaurant where the evening air felt cool and peaceful. She placed 1 cup in front of Ethan before sitting across from him. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Ethan reached into the leather portfolio he had brought with him and carefully removed a faded newspaper clipping protected inside a clear sleeve. He slid it across the table. Claire looked down. Her eyes rested on the photograph of a younger version of herself holding the Columbia University Investment Competition trophy. Her fingers remained perfectly still. After several quiet seconds, she looked back at Ethan. "You found it." Ethan nodded. "I was not looking for your past. I was trying to understand your present." Claire smiled faintly. Sometimes those are the same thing. Ethan looked at her with genuine respect. I also learned why you left school. Claire lowered her eyes toward the coffee for a moment before answering. Life asked me to make a choice. Do you regret it? Ethan asked gently. She thought carefully before speaking. I regret losing my father. I do not regret being there while I still could. The simplicity of her answer settled between them. Ethan had expected disappointment, perhaps bitterness. Instead, he found peace. Your professors believed you would become one of the finest investment managers in the country, he said. Claire smiled quietly. Professors are allowed to be optimistic. Ethan shook his head. They were right. Claire looked out toward the lights of the city. Maybe. Or maybe they only saw one version of success. Ethan leaned forward. Claire, I did not come here to offer charity. She looked back at him without speaking. I came because I believe someone with your ability deserves every opportunity that was taken away by circumstances beyond your control. He carefully placed another document on the table. It was not an employment contract. It was an offer to fully fund the completion of her graduate education at any business school she chose, along with a flexible research fellowship through Carter Capital that required no obligation to work for his company afterward. Claire read every page slowly. There was no repayment clause, no hidden condition, no requirement to sign away years of her future. She looked at Ethan with quiet surprise. You are not asking me to work for you. Ethan smiled. No, I am asking whether there is still a dream you never had the chance to finish. If the answer is yes, I would like to remove one obstacle. What you do afterward should remain entirely your decision. Claire closed the folder gently and looked at him with eyes that reflected gratitude, caution, and deep thought all at once. For the first time since they had met, she did not answer immediately, because some opportunities were too meaningful to be measured in dollars alone. Claire remained quiet for several moments, her fingertips resting gently on the folder as the sounds of the city drifted softly through the evening air. Finally, she looked at Ethan with a calm smile that carried both gratitude and honesty. When I left school, she said quietly, I promised myself that if I ever returned, it would not be because someone felt sorry for me. Ethan nodded without interrupting. I understand. She continued, Tonight, I do not feel that way. I feel respected. There is a difference. Ethan smiled. That difference matters to me. Claire looked down once more before carefully closing the folder. Then I would like to accept your offer, but only on one condition. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Name it. If I finish what I started, I want to spend part of my time teaching families who have never believed finance belonged to them. I do not want knowledge to stay inside boardrooms. Ethan laughed softly, not because the idea sounded unrealistic, but because it sounded exactly like the woman sitting across from him. That is not a condition, he replied. That is the best investment proposal I have heard in years. 16 months passed. Seasons changed across Manhattan. Winter gave way to spring, and spring welcomed another bright autumn. Claire completed her graduate studies with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every chapter of her life. She accepted a strategic advisory fellowship with Carter Capital, but unlike the executives who occupied corner offices overlooking the city, she divided every week between the firm's research department and community classrooms, where she continued teaching financial literacy free of charge. The fellowship became something unexpected. Under Claire's guidance, Carter Capital launched a new educational foundation, dedicated to helping working families, first-generation college students, and small business owners understand investing, budgeting, and long-term financial planning. Instead of expensive seminars reserved for wealthy clients, the foundation organized free workshops in libraries, schools, and neighborhood centers throughout the city. Attendance exceeded every expectation. Ethan often watched from the back of the room as Claire explained compound growth using simple language that made complicated ideas feel approachable. People did not leave those classes believing they could become billionaires overnight. They left believing they could make wiser decisions tomorrow than they had made yesterday. To Ethan, that was a far greater achievement. One afternoon, after another successful workshop, Daniel handed Ethan a familiar piece of paper that had been carefully preserved inside a protective sleeve. It was the original restaurant receipt from the evening they first met. Across the bottom remained a $20,000 gratuity Claire had politely refused. Daniel smiled. I found this while organizing old expense records. I thought you might want it. Ethan looked at the receipt for a long moment before slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket. I will keep it. For the memory? Daniel asked. Ethan shook his head gently. For the lesson. Later that evening, Ethan stopped by the Sterling house for dinner. The restaurant looked much the same as it had on the night everything began. The chandeliers still reflected warm light across polished tables. Soft piano music still drifted through the dining room. Richard Collins welcomed him with a smile. You still come back here, even though Claire no longer works with us. Ethan looked around the familiar room before answering. Some places remind us who we used to be. As he walked toward the exit, he paused beside the table where he had once tried to entertain his friends with a careless joke. It looked perfectly ordinary now. Yet to him, it had become the most valuable classroom he had ever entered. He smiled quietly before stepping outside into the cool Manhattan evening, where thousands of people hurried past one another without noticing the stories hidden behind ordinary faces. And perhaps that was life's quietest truth. The greatest wealth is not found in the person who speaks the loudest, earns the most, or occupies the largest office. Sometimes it quietly pours your coffee, listens before answering, and changes your future with a single sentence spoken in kindness, because the wisest people rarely need to prove who they are. They simply give the world a reason to discover it for itself.